I see some faces I think I've seen before here, but for the most part, no. Okay. I've done this, what now?
This
Five
is like
times? We're on our fifth library. And I don't know how many more libraries there are in Suffolk County, but it'll wind down pretty soon. So I thought maybe since perhaps some of you have already seen some of the library performances, shall we call it, they were streamed with Gina's help. So maybe we try a different approach tonight, and that was my thinking. I don't know how much different it will end up being, but I'll give it my best. Anyway, some people have, hold on a second.
What?
Is that better? Yeah. Some people have asked me, how did you ever get involved in the law? What brought you all to this? In fact, the people I was with last night, they wanted to know this. They were from Peacock. Peacock is a huge multimedia company, and they're doing a story on this whole case. They're the ones who have sponsored Miss Ellerup, Rex Hoyerman's wife, for her to, they're filming her as she goes from her house to the court. And yesterday that she was there. And so they're very interested in things. And they said to me, we're curious as well, why are you doing this? Why are you even in this? And what's your background? You haven't really talked about it. Who are you? Was the question. And I was taken a little by surprise because I hadn't had to answer that yet. So tonight I'll just give you a real quick taste of who I am and why I'm here, why am I doing this, and then we'll go into what we are doing. All right. So I'm just a working class guy. My parents, friend, okay, it's all right. My parents raised me in Nassau County in Bethpage. Started in Queens Village, and I come from a nice Irish family of 7 brothers and sisters, and I'm the second. And when I was a little boy going to Catholic school, in the 4th grade, I had a very fine nun named Sister Edward Marie, and they had a book fair, and they said, you have to buy a book. It was the first book I ever bought, and she said, you'll like this one. And I liked her, so I figured that was okay. And it was a book of St. Thomas More of London. Hold on a second. It's blurry back there? Okay, so I'll hold it away. Is that better? Okay. So it was a book of St. Thomas More of London. And he was a lawyer who lost his head because he stood by his principles against the king. And the first book I ever bought, and I still have it in my library, believe it or not. And he inspired me. I thought this was the cat's meow. He really stood up to authority. I like that. I like to be headed too, kids like that. but many years later, I actually, when I lived in England, which I did, I went to Canterbury, the cathedral in town in England, which is the capital of their church, and that's where Thomas More was buried, in a little church. I think it was called St. Alphege. And I went there, and there was a Reverend Roper was the name of the man who ran the church. It was an Anglican church. So I knocked on his door because I thought maybe I could get to see something about the saint. And this little old fella came, and I said, your name, it says Roper here. And I remembered, it says, Thomas More's daughter was Margaret Roper. She married a Stephen Roper. And he said, yes, that's my direct ancestor. So he was a direct descendant of Thomas More. It was fascinating. And I got to be friendly with him. And he happened to be going all around the world with a cross, the Canterbury cross, a certain style cross that he was using to go to churches all over the world and speak about peace and that sort of good stuff. So we had become friends, and he invited me into the church and showed me where the crypt was and where Thomas More was buried. So that was a real inspiration for me. And anyway, but going back, when I was in 9th grade, my mother gave me a book about Louis Nizer. And some of you old folks here will remember Louis Nizer was a famous lawyer. And he, in America, and he wrote My Life in Court. It was a really interesting, detailed book about some of the famous cases he had, and I liked that. So I was inspired by that as well. And he used a system where he would use pink and red and green and blue pens for different things as he took notes in trial. I never forgot that, so I still use that today. If you see me in court, you'll see me with a big stack of pens, because I use blue for direct examination or black, and then I use red for cross-examination and green for redirect, and so on. So I can break up the topics when I'm working on trial. So I mean, there's little things like that kind of stayed in my mind. And when I finally went to college and got rid of my wild oats and so on, I had a professor who, Dr. Ganfield Fowler, who was a history professor, and she said, "You need to go to law school." So she helped me. I took the test that you take to get in the entrance exam. The LSATs, I think they're called, and in those days they were different. But and I got on the waiting list for University of Wisconsin, so I was doing pretty well, And I gave the graduating commencement address to my graduating class at Hunter College in New York City, where I died and got to heaven. Because if any of you know the city, you know that Hunter was a school, it was a beautiful, great, very powerfully good college, but it was almost all women. So when I went in, it's amazing. I was in my Latin class, I was the only man in the class. It was just, like I said, I died with heaven. So, but in any event, when I came out of there, by just circumstance, I also liked being a teacher, a history teacher. I liked history, studied history very intensely. I got into all the honors programs and so on, so because I loved history. So when I came out, I was a substitute teacher. In those days, you could be a substitute even if you hadn't graduated from college. And they were paying us $40 a day without taking out taxes, and that was a fabulous amount of money to be making. So I and my best friend, we were teaching while we were going to college in our senior years. We were substitute teaching, and I substituted at my high school, Bethpage. So here I was in Bethpage High School. I was 21, the kids were 18, we were 3 years apart, and I was the lifeguard at the local pool and also the skate guard in the winter. So I knew everybody, they all knew me, and it was fabulous. It was just a wonderful, you can just imagine. And here I am with my teachers, and I used to Mr. So-and-so, Miss Dowd, first name basis. It was very enchanting, and I'd been athletic. I was 210 pounds. And I played linebacker for the Long Island Giants, your local semi-pro team. And I got recruited into that, so I liked that, I was doing that, and all of a sudden I forgot about law school. And I went on to become a teacher, and high school teacher, history. I taught in several schools. St. Paul's, if you saw yesterday's Newsday, the big picture of St. Paul's that they're in Garden City, they don't know what to do with it, whether to tear it down, keep it. I lived in that building and taught there my early career in teaching. And then I coached wrestling and lacrosse and football. And it was for a middle class guy, a working class guy, it was a big step up. I was big horizons for me. But then I came to Suffolk County. I worked at one or two other jobs in between. And I came to Suffolk County, and where I grew up in the summer in Rocky Point in the bungalows. You all had that, many of you had that experience, right? Sound Beach, Shoreham, Rocky Point. And so I was in a familiar place. And I ended up teaching at Miller Place High School, where from there got involved in local politics. And my mentor, who was the county executive of Westchester County, and also the Republican chairman of Westchester County, a very powerful man. He ran Nelson Rockefeller's famous quest for the presidency in 1964 against Goldwater, and he lost, but he was the guy that was in charge, Ed McKellian, and he was my mentor. He said, "Why don't you go into law school? You're going to be in politics." And I said, I was going to go to law school, and I just got diverted. And so I went in, took the LSATs again, and I got into St. John's University in Queens, and teaching in Miller Place and driving every day to law school on a motorcycle. And I went to, I was a Republican politician, so I would run political headquarters for the Republican Party nearby to where I worked in the school. And then, as a political reward for my work, they gave me a job as a supervisor of Brookhaven Airport, and which is still there off of William Floyd Parkway. So I would go from school to the airport, from the airport to the Republican headquarters, from Republican headquarters to St. John's University, from Shirley to Queens, and for 4 years, and came out. And I came out, and the day I came out, I wanted to work in the law. So there was a firm called Gianelli and Hughes. Many of you may remember Paul Gianelli was a very famous lawyer in Suffolk County, a criminal lawyer, a very great lawyer. And I got to know him because when I ran for office as a renegade Republican, he ran as a Democrat. I was running for the town of Brookhaven supervisor. He was running for district attorney. We became friends. His office was in Miller Place on North Country Road. It was an old 18th, 19th century building, mixed. And he said, "Why don't you come and clerk for me?" And so I did. And while I was clerking, Paul decided to break up his partnership, and he said, "Will you buy half of my building?" So I did. And that's where I started my law practice, and I'm still there since July 1st, 1983. And I've been there ever since. George Hughes, with the other fellow, nice man, I bought his half in 1989, and I kept my building ever since. Expanded, I had 5 offices all around the metropolitan area, out in Southampton, down in Shirley, in Bethpage, my hometown, and in New York City. And I started to try cases all around in several states and got myself a pretty decent reputation doing litigation and trial work and also general practice. It's still that way to this day. I haven't changed it at all. So that gives you a quick flavor, background. So, who is this guy? That's how I got to be there. And I found from the very first case I ever had, the value of publicity in a case. So people say, "Why are you always in the headlines?" You just love the headlines. And like I said to the New York Times a few weeks ago, if you saw the article, there's a full-page article last Sunday about the case and me. I said, I don't chase the headlines, they chase me. And the very first case I had, I was 1 week in practice, and there was a fellow named Dick Schaap. Do any of you old-timers remember Dick Schaap? He was a sportscaster, he was a sports announcer, sort of a competitor to Howard Cosell. His wife, Madeline, hired, through sheer coincidence, through people I knew, and she hired me to represent her in a landlord-tenant battle in New York City, where she lived in a penthouse with her children. She was divorced, and they were trying to throw her out for failure to pay and so on. It was down in the meatpacking district when the meatpacking district was still a meatpacking place. and it just started to have these other kinds of buildings, you know, with skylights and all that sort of thing. So she hired me to fight the landlord. I had never been in a court except once to fight a political case. I had no idea what the word application meant. I had no idea how you got an adjournment. I didn't know what you called the judge. And I took the case. And very first thing that happens is, because of who she was, there's a columnist for the New York Daily News whose name was Liz Smith. Liz Smith, yeah. So Liz Smith hears about the case, and because I'm this mystery, you know, I come out of nowhere. I'm not a well-known lawyer in New York because I'm not anybody. I'm just, you know, out here. And so they think, the firm against me thinks I must be somebody. You know, and in those days, we didn't have the internet that you could look somebody up right away. So I was a mystery. They thought, who is this guy? He must be somebody, for sure. So they immediately made a big deal out of the case, and they went to Liz Smith. And so she writes a column about me back in March of 1983. I had gotten admitted March 23rd. And so it made publicity, and it generated 8 more landlord-tenant clients in New York City who pay a lot of money, unlike out here where you're fighting for a penny, you know. And it made me kind of well-known from that point. So that caused, because of that case, and by the way, I settled the case for her because they thought they must have been up against some Superman. What am I doing there? Who is this man? And I had no idea. So we settled the case for her, and then I settled the other cases as well. And I made a lot of money. Here I am as teacher. I'm still teaching, by the way, at the time, and I'm pocketing. You know, I'm taking a day off to go into the city and come back out and so forth. So it was fascinating. But right after that, the second case that came because of that first case was a senior citizens from the Middle Island School District came to me. They had a senior citizens organization. They would meet on a Tuesday or something. They said, would you come and speak to us? They had read about me and Liz Smith. And so I said, sure. I went in and talked, and they hired me to object because the school district was publishing supporting documents to support passing the budget. So the school board was saying, vote for the budget, which they can't do. They're supposed to be neutral. And they were spending all their money doing this. So it being illegal, and I not having this first clue about how to go about fighting it, I said, sure, I can do that, no problem. And I walked in, I got the forms and all the rest, I figured it out somewhat. And I walked in to the court in front of Justice John J.J. Jones, and he signed the order to show cause, and the judge didn't realize, I don't think he ever really read it, I think his law secretary read it, and he didn't realize that when he was signing one of the stays, the injunctions in the temporary order, shut down the whole school because they didn't do it right. They had to close the school. They had to send home all their employees, a big central school district like yours here. And they had to send everybody home, and the kids had to come in, they had to bring the buses in early, and it was just crazy. I mean, I didn't know I was doing that. I had no idea that was what I did. So now that becomes even more famous, and from there, so I'm getting famous, but meanwhile, that impresses a local reporter, a journalist for one of the local newspapers here, and she was married. She was an American citizen, but she was married to a guy named Noshivaran Hatemi, who Hatemi was a Persian. He was an Iranian. And the Ayatollah, if you remember, again, your older folks can remember it, the Ayatollah Khomeini had just overthrown, just in 1979, had overthrown the Shah of Persia, of Iran. And when he had done that, it was a big revolution there that brought in, you know, these radical Muslims took over, and it was a big deal back in its time. So when that happened, now we're in 1983, by then the Ayatollah had firmed up his power all through the Iranian system, and the Shah's people had been thrown out. But in the United States, the Shah's people were very strong because he had sent thousands and thousands of Iranian kids to the schools here, the universities, to get an education in medicine and so on. And they would get scholarships from the money from Iran. They would pay into America, and these kids would all go to, there were thousands of them in Stony Brook, for example. And they were called Shah people versus the Ayatollah people. And so when that happened, the Ayatollah threw everybody out that he could. He got their hands on as Shah people, and he got his people in. They took over a not-for-profit corporation in New York called it was at the time called the Pahlavi Foundation. The Pahlavi Foundation was run by the Shah, whose last name was Pahlavi. And instead of him anymore, now he was out, they changed the foundation's name to Mustazafan Foundation, which I don't know exactly what the word meant, but it had something to do with peace that really meant war. You figure it out, I couldn't. But then they changed the board composition of the not-for-profit corporation and put their people in. And then once they had done that, the first thing they did is they went to their building that the Shah used to own in Rockefeller Plaza, one of the big tall buildings there, right in the plaza itself, right around where the big statue is and so on. And they took over the building in New York through this Mustazafan Foundation. And in the building, they set up all their people, and one of them was Hatemi. And Nushivaran was in charge of their whole educational system in America. So he decided, if you had an Iranian kid, he decided whether he got a scholarship or not, and he could come to America or not. And he was also in charge of the, what was the name of the language that they spoke? Farsi. He was in charge of the Farsi schools all over America. And there were a lot of Farsi schools, especially in the minority neighborhoods, all over America. And this man was very powerful. So they went to him and said, there's going to be a vote for the Ayatollah. And the vote is going to take place by what they call the plebiscite. You either vote for him or against him. There were no other candidates. And they copied Napoleon. That's how Napoleon used to get himself elected, by plebiscite, they call it. And so how would you vote if you're sitting here in New York? The Iranian embassy said to all the Iranians here, you turn in your Iranian passports to us, and that's your ballot. Which would mean that they couldn't get in or out without the approval of their government. They had to do everything their government told them to do because they had to have a passport. And that's how, so Hatemi balked. He didn't want to do that because he knew that if he gave them the passport, they could make him go back to Iran, where he could be killed if he didn't do the right thing. And he was married to an American journalist and had children with her. And he began to say, wait a minute, I like America more than I like this Mustazafan business that was going on. So he refused to turn over his passport. Meanwhile, he'd been switching all these kids. All these Shah people lost their scholarships. They were thrown out of the schools. It was a big revolution. And there were some murders that took place as well that involved the Iranian ambassador for the United Nations. And I got to know all this from the case. And so he comes to me because of the senior citizens from Middle Island. They lived in Middle Island. And he comes to me and says, can you help me? He had the courage to stand up to the Ayatollah and say, I want to keep my job, and I'm not giving up my passport, and they said, well, we're going to fire you from your job. And they said, okay, that's called discrimination. You can't do that in America. And so he retained me to sue the Ayatollah Khomeini for religious discrimination. That was my third case. Anyway, so you get the idea, you start to get why I'm in this case. All right, does it make some sense to you? And anyway, so we sued the Ayatollah, we did it, And with that, I get a whole bunch of Jewish women. They're Iranian Jewish people who live in Roslyn and Manhasset. They're very wealthy, and they're all involved in the trade of gold. And they come to my office and say, will you represent us too? Because they went to work, they all worked at the Pahlavi Foundation building in Rockefeller Plaza, but now they had to be Ayatollah people, and they had to wear a shadur. And they didn't want to do that. And since they were Jewish, they were told they couldn't have Jewish holidays. They were certainly pushed around. It's amazing that nothing worse, but that's how it works. So they came to me and said, can you represent us as well? And I said, sure, I'll do that too. I never filed a pleading. I had no idea how to do it. But anyway, then they finally decided, they backed down. Suddenly they overnight backed down. And it turned out that there was a murder that took place, and the guy was wrapped up in a Persian rug, believe it or not, or honest to goodness Persian rug, and was found, I think, floating in the East River or something, and all of a sudden a lot of people peeled away. So I ended up being in the newspaper about that, and because of that, it was the first time that the publicity issue that I started this discussion tonight with made a difference. Because now, when that case was published, people came forward and called me and said, yeah, I worked there too, I got fired, and I started to build a whole coterie of witnesses against the Ayatollah. It wasn't easy to serve them, by the way. You can imagine how hard that was. But we managed it. So the publicity generated witnesses. Witnesses generated litigation strength. And it was that strength that I used ultimately to settle the case. And he got some money, but he didn't want to go to trial because he was afraid of being killed. He had to hide up his wife and children, they had to go hide in an obscure school district because of their fear. For several years they disappeared just because they were afraid of what was going to happen. But meanwhile we settled the case. So it made a difference, and thank God we settled it, because I was against Delson and Gordon, which at that time was the biggest international law firm in the world. And they broke up, by the way, right during the case, which is kind of a nice little twist. But it was just this one little guy in another place, little backwoods place, how are you going to do that? So I learned a lot from that. And from there, I won't detail all the other cases. You can read them if you go look on my website. A lot of them are in there, not all of them by any means. But ever since then, that's the way I've operated. And that method of operation over and over and over again provided me the substance of my work because it generated huge advantages in litigation. Do any of you, and I'll finish on this part and then we'll move on to the real reason you came here today, but you remember the case back in the 90s? It was the Sheriff Dooley's lawyer when the sheriff got in trouble with the scandal. I was Sheriff Dooley's lawyer. And that generated witnesses that were critical when he got in a car accident out in Chicago in a scandal. And I was able to generate witnesses from Chicago who were from Long Island and knew Dooley, and they helped us out in the case. It also hurt him in some other ways, but it helped out. But if any of you remember the case back in the 90s, where there was a man from your town, I believe it was, yeah, yours, maybe it was Center Reach, maybe I'm off, but he was a young, middle-aged man named Joe Kaplan, who had a surrogate parenting situation with his wife's high school best friend's daughter. And he had a surrogate child by her. And it became a huge scandal it was all over the world, because Joe and Susan was 24 years old, Joe was 43. He had been a Ukrainian who had come to America, met his wife who worked at the passport counter, They got married, they tried to have children, they couldn't. They tried, they did operations, everything didn't work. So they decided to look to surrogate parenthood. And his wife's best friend said, my daughter is interested in being a surrogate mother. And so they made the arrangement, but she said, look, it's going to take forever to get the blood tests done and get them approved. And she had had an operation that tied up her fallopian tubes. So she had to have them untied. And when you do that, they could grow back real quick. So she said there was a time pressure on her to have the baby or it wasn't going to work. So they decided on a shortcut. And that shortcut took place at the Comac Motor Inn. And as you say, with real cases, you cannot make them up. There's much more detail I won't titillate you with, but in any event, eventually the baby is conceived. And I never forget it because it was on my holy day, March 17th, St. Patrick's. And don't say St. Patty's. He's not a Patty, he's Patrick. St. Patrick's Day. All right. And anyway, on St. Patrick's Day in the rain, Joe Kaplan calls me and says, look, there's newspaper trucks all around my house, and I'm being sued. And there's a guy named Robert Gottlieb, who was a famous lawyer out here, and criminal lawyer, and he went to the press and sued. He gave out all the complaints to the press and didn't bother to tell Joe until the press was all around Joe's house about to film him, because Joe wanted to, he wanted to have the baby and get custody, and Susan was going to fight him and said that, he abused her and so forth, and they brought a lawsuit. The baby hadn't yet been born. And so he came to me on March 17th. We went and fought the case. And it was a very famous case in its time, back in 1991 or thereabout. And long and short, it became widely publicized. And I went to court in front of Judge Dave Freundlich, who was the head of the family court at that time. And I said to him, Judge, the baby we need a C-section birth here, because I had gotten information which came from witnesses, which came from the publicity, that Susan was suffering from an STD. And if the baby passed through the fallopian tubes and so on, the uterus, and it would have been born blind possibly from the disease that she had. And so I demanded that the baby be C-sectioned, and also that the baby be given a bris. Okay, the baby was a boy, and Joe was Jewish, and Susan was sort of fallen away Catholic. So Joe said, I want the baby to be named Shane, and Benjamin, and Susan said, I want the baby to be named Shane. And all this was every day in the
You're news. In the news again.
You're in the news all the time. So it was generating more and more witnesses as this went on. By the way, the judge said, no C-section, we're going to let it be born. And sure enough, the baby was born with an eye defect. Amazing, right? This actually happened. So, but in any event, the baby was born, they had the bris, and the baby was named Shane because Mama kept the baby for the time being while we had a fight in family court over the custody of the child. And of course, we challenged the surrogate agreement completely, the surrogate parent agreement. And as a result of that case, State Senator Helen Weinstein in Manhattan made surrogate parenthood in New York outlawed because of that case. They've now, since years later, they changed the law back and it's legal again, but it was illegal for many years. Anyway, so when the baby gets born and this fight takes place, all these witnesses came in and said, from Florida to Maine, I slept with Susan. I know Susan real well. all right? And Susan was married, had 3 kids of her own, all of them which had been taken away from her by the judges and in Pennsylvania. And I had all these witnesses in every place you could imagine coming forward saying, I will testify. And the fame also does another thing. Where these witnesses would ordinarily be reluctant to testify, they couldn't wait to testify. Because they were in it. They were in the big case, right? That's what happened. So I learned a lot from all of that. And long and short, we did win the case. Initially, Susan was winning because she was going on Sally Jesse Raphael. Remember her? All right, yeah, some of you guys see going. I was on Sally Jesse too with Joe. we followed wherever Susan went, we went. And it was funny because the worst thing that ever happened that shows you about publicity was that Gottlieb, he was going around making all these appointments with these shows, and so he had an associate lawyer, young man that would go with him, and he didn't know this guy that I had come to learn. When you're in those shows, they have a bank of cameras from every direction. You don't even see them, and in the back rooms, they have all screen with all the different cameras showing at once. So when you're watching the show, which it's not live usually, but they're taking clips from each. They make up the whole show is made up of all these different clips during the show. So you don't know that. So and this young man did not know it, and he took a paper clip from his, and he started picking his ear. Yeah, and they showed it. Jesse Raphael. And that became the big issue of the day. Instead of, that really happened. So you have to learn something about the media's watching you at all times. You have to be careful, like I'm supposed to be right now, and I guess I'm not. But in any event, eventually the tide turned against Susan. And I was able to, not just because she had sex with so many different people, but she was really a sad sack, and somebody that deserved a lot of sympathy, actually. And I gave it to her during the trial. I didn't really smash her around. I had learned a lot by then. But instead, I just used I said, well, the time that you were with the man in New Jersey, you weren't home with your children, isn't that true? You spent the night, you gave much more to your personal attention, your own pleasure, than you did to children who were waiting for you when you weren't there, were they, Susan? And I used that over and over again. It was very effective, and we won the case. Joe got the baby, and the baby went on to become Benjamin. He lived happily ever after. I understand he's got a very nice job, and he became a child actor. And he went on to a good life. Susan did not, and Joe did, and so it goes. But I digress. You see what I'm saying about the use of the media. I found how effective it could be just by these things, and I another panoply of stories I could tell, but I won't. All right, I know we don't have that for tonight. All right, so that's where I came from. There it is, and I've done my share of criminal work. I think I'm up to my 30-some odd, I forget, 33rd possibly, I can't remember now, but homicide case that I've worked on in various places in America, not only here in New York, but upstate in Buffalo, in a case related to this case that you haven't heard much about, which is really fascinating. And I will tell you about it tonight, a homicide that took place in Buffalo. And I've gotten that experience in criminal law as well, so that I've dealt with all the kind of people that we're dealing with in this case before, several times. And you kind of get to know something more about them from experience. So when people say, well, you're looking for the headlines, you're darn right we are, and we know why. Because it's giving us some advantage that nobody else has had, especially when the police shut down the public from the investigation and refused to come forward and help out. And that's where the role that I have played has come into the story, because I'm the door that opens, and through me, the witnesses have come in, as you may know. So, and that's been recognized even by the Commissioner of the Police of Suffolk County, Rodney Harrison. So, that can only come about by the way that I've just explained to you. So, jumping far ahead, therefore, I start with this as well when we go into the main story now. I'm assuming that you know about this case. You've been paying attention to it. You can't miss it on television if you watch it on the internet as well. You can't miss it in the newspaper if you still read, which aren't many of you. Raise your hand. No. Interestingly, by the way, I teach 1 night a week at Suffolk County Community College. I teach the business law and paralegals and so on. And I do it because I like to do it. And I've done it since 1984, 1 night. And so I have right now, I have 33 students in a class. And I say to them, and they're all young people in their 20s, I say to them, how many of you heard of the Long Island serial killer case? Out of 33 hands, maybe 3 go up.
Oh, no way.
I'm not kidding.
They don't care.
They don't watch TV. They watch whatever they watch on their internet, and that's it. Only 3 or 4 of them, that's it. And they didn't know. I'm not kidding. So that I used to ask, the question I used to like to ask was, how many of you, when we live 55, I have an apartment in Manhattan over on 23rd and Broadway by the Flatiron Building, so right kind of central, south central New York. And we're from my house in Port Jefferson to the apartment in New York, where I also have an office. I think it's a 55-mile distance, something like that. And so you're 55 miles away. If you go non-rush hour, you can get there in an hour and 20 minutes, hour 15 minutes. With that in mind, in the greatest city in the world, how many of you students have ever been to Manhattan? And you'll get about maybe 40%, roughly. And how many of you have been to Manhattan more than 3 times? And there might be 1 or 2.
Wow.
And that's about it.
That's crazy.
And they live. So the world is not what you think it is, right? It's a very parochial world. And so you're sitting here saying, well, everybody knows what I know. You think that, but it's not true. So I say it with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, or maybe advisedly, as the lawyers like to say. I'm assuming that you know the case. You know about the case, you paid attention to it, you watched. And so instead of me trying to take you like 2020 did and Dateline did recently, so I'm not going to take you through step by step by step. You can do that by watching any one of those shows, or if you want to, they streamed me several times in the libraries when I've talked about step by step. So I won't do that now. Okay, I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about. And so I'll start you with this to give you a different taste and a different insight. The sex industry, like all other modern industries, has really grown and benefited from the internet and from the cell phone and from the computer. And they grew in about the same proportions and the same structures as did other major multinational corporations. The sex industry grew starting in about 2000 and coming forward. Enormous growth, enormous strength, enormous organization on a scale that we do not comprehend. It's kind of like the fentanyl industry and the cocaine industry. You say, how, did you ever wonder, well, the Colombians are making a lot of money, the Mexican gangs are making a lot of money and so on fentanyl and coke. But they wouldn't make the money if you weren't using it, right? And so it's the consumption of it that drives it. And so the heart of the problem lies in the people themselves and their use of it. You don't like to hear that, maybe? Well, that's the truth. And it's the same for the sex industry. The consumption for the sex industry is vast, and it's growing all the time, largely over the internet especially. But the people who service it and make money from it have highly organized themselves all across America, up into Canada, all into Europe, and so on. And it's on a scale that this case you're hearing about, Long Island serial killer case, which has become so powerfully important in the world, is just a mini insight to the much greater problem. And I'm not a crusader, you understand, so I hope if I sound like that, it's not my intention. But you can't avoid noticing what I've just said. And I came to know it in a way that I hadn't anticipated before. And that was this. You all heard of one of the Gilgo Four was Melissa Barthelemy. She lived in Lockport, which is sort of like the Queens of County of Buffalo, right? Working class community up in Buffalo. And she came down to make it in the big time in New York, and here's where she ends up. Very sad story. I got to meet her parents, her mother anyway, and her mother's boyfriend, and I spoke with her sister up there. It was the murderer used her phone, Melissa Barthelemy's phone, after he killed her, to call the sister and say to the sister, "Are you a half-breed like your sister?" And then he called 7 or 8 times, I forget which, and in each one of those calls he made a more and more vicious statement to her, where he was saying foul and incredible things I can't repeat about how she died and so on. That's Melissa Barthelemy. Years after that case was known and moving forward, and I had become associated with the case, with all the cases, I had friends from the media industry because of that. I mean, I had a lot of friends that had just developed. I had one particular friend who was she was a producer, assistant vice president for a production company for media production, and I had this very peculiar case. How many of you ever saw the movie Bridge of Spies? Yeah. Remember that movie, right? Just a few years ago with, was it Tom Hanks? Right, he was the hero in that. There was a guy who, his name was Rudolf Abel, or Abel in America we call him, but Abel was his real name. Rudolf Abel was the chief Soviet spy in the United States, probably the greatest spy of all time. And he ran the entire Soviet, the entire communist underground system in the United States. But nobody knew who he was, and nobody could ever catch him. And then one day, you remember the Americans, we sent up the big spy plane, it's a glider plane, the U-2 it was called, and the big wings, and it would get up to about 60,000 feet and start to float down slowly, and it had an engine in it that you could use, but it normally floats, so you couldn't detect it, and it would take pictures of the ground. And that plane gets shot down, allegedly shot down, by the Russians when we denied that we ever had such an aircraft. It crashes, and the pilot manages to live. His name was Gary Powers. And you older timers, you know him well, right? And Gary Powers, he gets captured. And it was a big deal because the president denied, I think it was Eisenhower, denied that this thing happened, that it existed. And Nikita Khrushchev, the premier from Russia, said, yes, it did. He pounded his table, he got real angry, and he said, here's pictures of it, and he humiliated the United States. So Gary Powers was supposed to take a cyanide pill, and he didn't do it. He lived. And we wanted him back. Meanwhile, the Soviets are doing all their spying, and Rudolf Abel nobody knew about. They knew he existed, they knew about him, but they couldn't find him, they couldn't picture him, and so on. And then one day, a nice young boy, 14 years old, was delivering the Brooklyn Eagle, I believe it was, in Brooklyn, and he would collect, I delivered, some of you may have, I delivered Newsday, delivered the Long Island Press, right, and on your bicycle. Well, this guy would do this in Brooklyn, this kid, and he went up the second floor, and a woman paid him a handful of nickels. And he went down the stairs, and one nickel fell out of his pocket and bounced, boing, 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 down the steps. When you go to the movie, look at it again, the Bridge of Spies, the story opens with that event, with the nickel bouncing down the stairs. The nickel at the bottom of the stairs splits open, and it was cut on the edge this way instead of through it, right? And it opened up, and inside was this little thing attached to it, just a little fleck of a thing attached to the inside. So he picked it up and he took it home, showed his parents. There was a cop who lived next door. They showed the cop. The cop said, this is something that's really weird. He tells the FBI comes. It was microfiche inside a nickel. And from there, they didn't catch anybody from it right away. But later on, it was instrumental in catching Rudolph Abel, who also lived in Brooklyn. And somehow, somebody mistakenly paid that nickel to that woman, who paid it in turn to the boy who dropped the nickel and found the microfiche. And that 14-year-old boy is my best friend, and today, and he's in his 80s now. And Jim is he's an American hero because he did that. And back in the 1950s, when that happened, he was on the front page of every newspaper. He was a big American hero because Abel was caught, and they broke into Abel's hotel room, I think it was, in Brooklyn, and they captured him as he was trying to destroy pens that were also secret devices. And the FBI was there. It became a United States Supreme Court case because the Secret Service didn't do it right. They seized him illegally, at least it was argued, and successfully for a time. And so, if you ever want to look it up, U.S. v. Abel, A-B-E-L, you'll see it's a very famous case. The FBI agent who did the arrest, by sheer coincidence, lived in Bethpage, and his son was my friend, Glenn Gambler. And amazing, I mean, just amazing connection. So he was a big hero in Bethpage because his father had caught up. And later on, through another case that had nothing to do with this, I became Jim Bozart's lawyer, and we became best friends. And he was the boy. So it's a fascinating story, isn't it? But what happened was, because of that, it went on for years. He was a hero. He got a full scholarship to Rensselaer. He was an engineer, and it was great. Great life he had. Well, one night we were sitting in a little restaurant called Rayo's in New York, and we were talking about the nickel. And Jim said to me, he said, I never saw the nickel again. It was my nickel. So I said, you know what? Let's get the nickel back. So, long and short, I went after the nickel against the FBI and the spies in the whole federal government, and they were just building a brand new spy museum in Washington. It's a beautiful museum, and the nickel had disappeared. It had been in the FBI's museum for a long time, and then it went away. Nobody knew what happened to it, or so they told me. And I chased it around, and the bureaucracy in Washington, and I brought on I didn't actually have to sue them, but I put together the lawsuit, sent it to them, and said, we're going to sue you if you don't come up with the nickel. And all of a sudden, they came up with the nickel, and they said, yep, it's still there, it's in the spy museum. So I said, well, it's ours. You never gave it back. It's still his property after all these years. And they said, you're right. They recognized it, and they held a big ceremony back about 2 years ago in Washington at the brand new Spy Museum. I went, Jimmy went, my family went, and they had a big ceremony, and they delivered back to us the nickel. And so that became a little mini story that the production people in Hollywood wanted to film, and they thought they'd make something out of it. So this woman came, she did the filming. Long and short, we end up with possibility of a film, and it never got made, by the way, a bigger film instead. And but Jimmy and I stayed friends. So this woman now calls me from California, and she says, listen, I have a little group of people who are very involved in a murder that takes place up in Buffalo, and they need you. Okay? Why? Well, it turns out that Amanda Winchowski was her name, was a beautiful girl in her 20s who got seduced into the sex market, the sex trade, like so many of these other girls. And she's found naked, frozen in January in Buffalo, upside down in a garbage can with the top on. And when they find her, of course she had a heroin habit. They found heroin in her system, about the average amount a heroin addict would have, and the medical examiner ruled that she died from an overdose, just because she had the chemical in her. And so how did she get in the can? Well, I said, well, she died first, and they probably dumped her in the can. But they didn't know. The mother, however, Leslie, said, no, my daughter was murdered. And she had her reasons to believe that. So she hired experts, they exhumed the body, they tested, they brought the body to California, tested the body, and long and short, the expert there, who was a friend of Dr. Biden, who used in our case, she rules that it's a homicide. There are marks on the girl's neck, there are black and blue marks in various places, there are strangulation marks, and she says it's a homicide. That didn't sell. She was ignored, and the medical examiner stuck to her conclusion. And then Leslie went and hired another expert, a toxicologist who came in, tested everything, and said there's no way this girl could have died of an overdose of heroin. It was too small an amount in her system. She was a regular user, so that just didn't make any sense. And he said she died of homicide. It was ignored. 3 more experts all conclude the same thing. She was killed. The last one, however, was recent. Up until then, every time Leslie went back into court or to the medical examiner, they just threw it out, said no. So now they said, we need John Ray, okay? So, and this woman who had worked on the nickel case was also working on this case with this little group. So she said, can you go up there and help her? So I met Leslie, I flew up, and I met her, and I looked at all of her papers, and I told her, I said, look, there's a 4-month statute of limitations on changing a medical examiner's report. The report said accident, right? Cause and manner of death, accident, overdose. And we needed to change that. Why? Because if it stayed an accident, the police department said, we can't investigate this. This is an accident. We investigate crime. There's no crime. No crime, no investigation. And so nothing could happen. And Leslie was doing her own investigation, but she was just a regular lady, a mother, and she didn't, she had no expertise in this whatsoever. So they said to me, how do we overcome this? I said, well, get another expert, let's see what happens. They got one, and the expert came back and said, he was an internationally renowned expert, and he said, yes, it was a homicide. So with that fresh information, I went into court up in Buffalo, and I argued that I brought a proceeding what they call an Article 78. It's a special proceeding where you ask the court to order a government official, do this. You're prohibited from doing that. Or whatever the government official did that's wrong, the judge has the right to say, don't do this or do that. They're called writs, from the old British writs handed down, but they were gathered together under what's now called the Article 78 proceeding. And so I sought a writ of mandamus, meaning we order you. That's the Latin, that's what it means. And we asked that the judge order that the medical examiner reopen the exam and look at this because of the evidence and the circumstantial evidence that she was involved in sex trafficking, and that she had, which brings me back to where I started, that she had actually been part of a sex trafficking organization, a vast organization that stretched all the way up into Montreal and to Toronto and to Hollywood and to New York City. And it was all part of one big organization that she was a part of. And Leslie had done the work to get a lot of that information. So I began to work on that as well. And we realized that the connections, that we could make physical synapses, connections, evidentiary connections, because this is always about evidence, isn't it? In the end, not what you want to believe, but what is. And the evidence pointed clearly to a very highly organized, which is why I said to you, very highly organized management system of sex workers, where their managers would have lists of girls, and in some cases boys, that they would sell the way you sell a list of highly skilled employees in top management. They had lists, and they would sell the list to one another. The one that we were involved in with Amanda had over 600 girls on the list, and they would be sold en masse from one guy to another for zillions of amounts of money. And these girls would travel with the list, and Amanda was part of that. So when I got involved in this case, and while the motion was pending, we were able to trace her connection to California. What happens is she was actually flown out to California by her pimp. They don't call them pimps anymore, so they have other names. Her gorilla, as he was known, and she was flown out to California where another part of the organization existed, and she was brought to what's called a bottom girl. And a bottom girl was a girl who recruits other girls into the industry, as Amanda was recruited. So Amanda came from this little, Lockport, nothing town, and had dreams and ideas that she was going to be an actress, and she was beautiful, a truly beautiful woman, and she was basically met at a football game from her high school, I believe it was. She was sitting in the bleachers, and the pimp came over to her, talked to her, and convinced her that he was going to be able to send her to Hollywood and help her out in that regard. And the poor girl, lonely, dreamy, foolish girl, goes with him. And the first thing that happens in all those cases when they get recruited is that the gorilla, he tells them, listen, you don't want to drive around in Chevys. You're going to go to Maserati, my Maserati. And come on, I'll take you downtown. Took her downtown Buffalo and said, go into Macy's right there, pick out whatever you like, it's yours. And wine and dined, and took these girls completely naive, who didn't necessarily come from very tight families, and they targeted these girls. They actually went to the game and were able to target her, sitting in the bleachers, understanding that she was lonely, she was naive, she was something that they all looked for. She had a streak of loyalty, which they need and they want, and got her into the system. And then talked her into sleeping with somebody else. And then again, and then again. And then came the multiple partners. And then came the beatings. As in, look, you got all the stuff, you can keep all the stuff you have, you're gonna have a great life, you know, use some drugs with us too, you're still gonna have a great life, but if you break the code, if you leave, you're dead. You're in trouble. So don't leave. And they beat the hell out of them to let them know that. Every one of those girls gets badly beaten. It's part of the deal. And that's what happened to Amanda. She gets sucked in, she can't get out, you don't dare get out. And at the same time, you know, it's a carrot and stick system that's going on. And so she went to Hollywood, and she went to the Bottom Girl. The Bottom Girl is one of the organizers, girls who recruits and trains these girls, and trains them not only in sexual technique, but trains them in how to deal with men. It's remarkable. They even have like a handbook of sorts, as you would in management in a regular industry. And they hooked her up with an actor in Hollywood whose name I know, who's a famous actor, and who you would know if I told you the name, but I'm not going to, sorry.
Oh, you can't do that.
I can't tell you the name. But take my word, is that worth it? I don't know. But a very well-known actor, and she and another girl would service this guy, and he was into little children. And that was part of the industry, another branch of the industry for kids. That actor still exists today. He's still there in Hollywood. When she goes to California, she goes with another girl. That other girl was Melissa Barthelemy. By the most amazing coincidence, and I didn't know this at first, but one night I'm talking to Leslie on the phone, you know, about the case, and I said to her, did you know I'm the lawyer for the Long Island serial killer case? Did you ever hear of that case? Oh yeah, I heard of that. So I'm the lawyer for the victims in that case. She says, oh, I know that case really well. Melissa Barthelemy's mother was my friend. And we hung out together. Just amazing coincidence. You can't make it up, can you? You know? And so we were able to connect Barthelemy, who ended up in Manorville, with Melissa and with Melissa's organization. So, I mean, Amanda's organization, sorry. And so, there's no question but that Melissa Barthelemy was hooked into a sex trafficking organization. That cannot be denied. And that plays a big role, wouldn't you think, in this investigation that's going on right now. I can't tell you what role it plays because I'm not the police. I don't know what they're doing with that information, but it exists, it's there. And we uncovered it by sheer coincidence. Some of the guerrillas were on Long Island that were buying the list and moving, and we could never figure out how all the guerrillas in this organization, and the word guerrilla, by the way, had nothing to do with race, nothing whatsoever. But they were African-American men in the middle level of the trade. And how did they end up with white girls servicing white clients? It seemed like an incongruous connection to me. And yet they managed to overcome the racial barriers, and that's the way the system really works. So you'll see that a lot of these girls, their pimps were African-American men who were working in the sex organization, but working for white people, of course. Side light on this, if you don't think race plays a role, when they sell girls in the industry, white girls are worth more than black girls. That's the way it is. Terrible, shocking, factual truth. And a disgrace, really, but that's the way it is. So much so that you'd be amazed how they enforce that. Girls, for example, if they're in a room with two gorillas and you belong to Gorilla A, you don't dare look into the eyes of Gorilla B. You will get the daylights beat out of you if you do, because you belong to Gorilla A. And that's how it is. So I was able to trace a former bottom girl to a Midwestern town, and she knew Melissa Barthelemy, and she knew Amanda. And so she could give me a lot of the information that I'm giving you tonight for the first time. I haven't made that public yet, but here it is. So fascinating, isn't it? I mean, absolutely fascinating. But you see the reach of these people and how far they. This guy who had the LISK, the gorilla who ran their LISK, was based in Toronto. Excuse me. And they spilled over into Canada. This whole organization, this whole operation. So to this day, as we speak, I don't know more than what I've told you in terms of connecting them up. But you can't deny there's a connection there. Parenthetically, the judge had decided against us. She said, it's a 4-month statute of limitations. And Amanda died in 2009. You're years too late, sorry. I said, well, what happens when new evidence comes forward and it turns out that the medical examiner 20 years ago, or 50 years ago for that matter, is wrong? And we know he's wrong. We have the actual chemical and physical evidence that they're wrong. Or we have people that admit it. I did it, she didn't, that kind of thing. What do you do then? It's up to the medical examiner. Or if the medical examiner doesn't want to exercise her discretion, isn't that an abuse of discretion? And the answer I would say is yes. The judge said the answer was no. So I lost. Well, I don't give up so easily. You might have noticed that too, I hope. So I learned that too a little bit in the trade that I went along. You just don't give up until there's no other avenue to go, until it's humanly impossible. And so I appealed it. All this was pro bono, by the way. So I got not a penny. I even had to pay for my own plane tickets and hotel. Anyway, I appealed it, and it now goes to Rochester, to the appellate court in Rochester for the 4th Department. And I went there, argued the case last March or April, I forget exactly, right somewhere in there. And I could tell, there's a panel, you get 4 judges on an appellate court, and I have argued plenty of cases in the appeals, various courts on appeals, so I was used to it. It wasn't going in for the first time. And I saw it, I could see it right away that we weren't going to win this case, just by the tone of the questions. And sure enough, we lost. And they said, 4 months, that's it. And why did they say that? Because in Brooklyn, in the Appellate Division 2nd Department, our Court of Appeals here, they had ruled that they said it's just 4 months or nothing. And so the 4th Department followed the 2nd Department. And the 2nd Department followed nothing but mush, intellectual mush, which is, I'm sorry to say, sometimes the case. So it was. Keep doing that. Anyway, I said I'd bring it to you in a different way, in a different light. I think you're starting to see that that's what I am going to do, all right? Assuming you know all the case, let's move on to another point, okay? In the investigation, well, let me not say that. Let me take back that word. In my work on the cases, I came into the case because of the murder of Shannon Gilbert. And I'm not going to let you sit here and say, because I have the mic and you don't, that, oh, no. She died by natural causes, or she drowned, as the police have said. The police know what they're doing. The police are the pros. You're not. And
Can we hold it over here?
that'd be great. Thanks. Don't trip on it. Thank you. Why not? Why not? I'm going to say that to you, that she's murdered. Not that she might have been murdered, she was likely murdered. No, she was murdered. Because I'm guided by evidence. And I've learned in 41 years of being a lawyer that it's evidence, always evidence, that makes or breaks the case. You can have surmise, and surmise is valuable. You can have inference. Inference is very valuable. You can have speculation. It too can be valuable. But none of those things, none of them are evidence. None of them are conclusory. The evidence are the pieces of the puzzle, and they're glued together by the inference. But without the evidence, there is nothing. So there are all kinds of wonderful theories. They come into my office every day of the week. Without exception, we are flooded with emails and phone calls from people who want to offer me evidence. And that's happened for years on this case. I have a whole room, as my assistant here can attest, filled with boxes of emails and so forth given to us by people who come and say, this is the killer, I can tell you what, this is the why, and so forth. We get this all the time, and we have to filter through it. But I've come to learn that the only thing that ultimately matters is evidence itself, nothing else. And then the inferences can be used. In this case, the evidence is overwhelming that Shannon Gilbert was murdered. Overwhelming. The evidence that she died of natural causes, drowning or any other cause, is zero. Zero. When did you ever hear of a law enforcement agency where people are devoted to evidence, especially the creme de la creme, the homicide detectives, whose lives and livelihoods and vocations depend upon the discovery and use of evidence? Evidence, always evidence. Did you ever hear them draw a conclusion that he did it or she did it without evidence? And without enough evidence to convict the person beyond a reasonable doubt? They live that. They breathe it. They have to. Or a murderer walks free. Right? Perfectly sensible point. So then why? And I don't necessarily have the answer, and I don't know, maybe you might. And if you do, come and tell me. Why would the Suffolk County Police Department take the position that that Shannon Gilbert died of natural causes, and most recently on May 13th, 2022, make the statement that she probably died of a tragic accident, when they don't tell you what the accident was, when they have not a scintilla of evidence that there was an accident, when they have not a scintilla of evidence that any particular natural cause killed her, when they have no evidence whatsoever that she drowned, and still conclude the negative of murder. She was not murdered. Who in the world ever heard of that? That the police department could do that? And that's what they have done. So if you want to say, well, you know, there's been, oh, you know, John Ray, he says these things, you know, well, he's just, you know, maverick. I invite you to show me the evidence that the police have ever cited that Shannon Gilbert died of an actual natural cause. It's not there. It's not there. So then the next obvious question should come to every one of you. Why did the police department for 12 years take that position that Shannon Gilbert died of natural causes and still insisted upon it as late as May 13th of last year? Why?
Was that one person, when you say police department, was it one person that said it?
It's one person who represents the police department,
The head person?
the head person.
The covered
Right.
for Burke.
The
And
commissioner.
they all follow, they can't say anything.
Yes.
It was Burke the whole time.
What's that?
The covered for Burke, they always have this.
Well, there may be a lot of inferences. I don't know what they are. They could be, you could be right. You know, there's no dispositive evidence of what you just said, that it could be Burke. But I do know this. There's no evidence that she died of natural causes. When she was found in the marsh, she was face up, laying with her head on a bush, her remains were, in a place where I walked it myself, in the marsh, in May, same week that she would have disappeared, but a year, 2 years later, right? And the water,
Yeah.
it was this deep, this inches deep, in most of the places in the marsh, and there were canals here and there, one or two small mosquito canals that were about as wide as I am to this lady, not even, and with boards over them all over the place because humans walk back there. And on May 1st, 2010, when she disappeared, the weather was very good. It was anywhere from the 50s, depending on the time of day, to the 70s that day, and there was no wind. So that she died of the natural elements is ridiculous.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
As a lawyer, or as an attorney, versus the police department, is the police department required to turn over all evidence to you? Or are they allowed to hold back evidence that they might think they don't want to release to you because they don't want it to get out to the public, because they don't want the person they're investigating or looking at, because they think he's good for something, that they don't want him to know that they're investigating?
Yeah, the answer is easy to your complicated question. And that is that the police have no duty whatsoever to release any evidence to the public, myself being one of them, at all. They, as long as it's an open, active, ongoing investigation, that's their favorite phrase, then they don't release any evidence that they don't want to. And they can hold it for years and years, as they did in this case. So
Could it be possibly, and nobody jump all over me, okay? I'm not siding with the police. So, but could it be that they were, and still are, lying to the public, God forgive me, there's a cop in the room, because they have information, or they're trying to, I don't know, dissuade people from thinking one thing and they're working on something else, and
their motives are as expansive as the motives of anybody doing something that is secret.
Yeah.
You know, you just don't, by definition, you don't know.
I can think of why they would say something, because you have all the evidence proving that it couldn't have been an accident, it couldn't have been this, and it couldn't be that, so why the heck would they put that information out there, other than to get people to think the opposite of what they want?
As I said, it's an open question. I don't have an answer to
Can you
your
just
question.
tell us what the
But one
evidence
thing,
is
just so
that
you
she's-
know, I promised that, I promised my assistant, I said, you know what we're gonna do is we're gonna do what we didn't do earlier. We're gonna open the questions up earlier. And given what I've now told you, the flavor and so on, I think it's time for that. This nice young lady here just did that. And so I'm opening the floor to your questions. Go ahead.
What is the obvious evidence that there was in fact foul play? Obviously, you're saying there's no evidence that she drowned. What is the obvious evidence
That she didn't drown.
that she was
That she was murdered.
Yeah, what's
There's
glaringly
an
obvious?
overwhelming amount of that evidence, starting with,
Give us some.
I'll give you some, because it'll take the rest of the night to give it to you,
Okay.
all of it. And you can, if you, by the way, if you look at what I've already spoken about, you'll see it there. I do cover it a lot. But simply, first of all, when Shannon goes to this tryst in Oak Beach from New York City, when she goes out there, we don't know anything about what really happened. You have only the word of a convicted sex trafficking felon, her driver, Michael Pack, and the word of the John, Joseph Brewer. Nobody else knows what happened, but that we know of, but they testified to, or I've taken their testimony. So and they're not necessarily believable people at all. So we don't know how it all developed. But one thing we do know is she, a sex worker, an experienced sex worker, working for a man who worked for a trafficking organization that night. She breaks ranks with anything that a sex worker ever does, which is they always turn to their driver when they're in trouble, and instead she calls 911. And the very first thing she does when she calls 911, she says, "Someone is after me." And she repeats it 3 times. And she repeats it louder and louder because the operator isn't getting it. She's perfectly rational. She's in severe fear. Someone is after me. Someone is after me. Later on, she says, in the same conversation on 911, she says, "They're trying to kill me. They are trying to kill me." Someone, then they. What does that mean? How can you avoid the meaning that there was a person chasing her and then there was a group involved in this? And when you listen to the tape, the 23-minute tape of Shannon Gilbert's voice, which you can all listen to, you know that, you've probably heard it enough. And we've heard it, I can't even tell you how many times, and we've had it broken down and we've had it enhanced. There are other people there.
That's what I was getting at. Are there any other voices?
There are other voices there. And regardless of that, here's a girl who takes that extreme step, okay? And what's to say she makes the call from Brewer's house in Oak Beach. I've been in that house, so I know exactly where she was. She makes the call from Brewer's house. She's not talking about Brewer. He's standing right there. She's talking about somebody else. So then what's to say that she started out in that house when she made the call? Instead, that she hadn't run from outside the house and come in to get away from who was after her. Someone is after me. She had on a jacket, a light jacket. It was light because April 30th, the weather was fine, the same way it was May 1st. She wore a light jacket. That jacket ended up in the driveway of Brewers. The police recovered the jacket. The medical examiner, Suffolk County medical examiner, told me and the Gilbert family that the police lost the jacket. It's the one item that would have had DNA on it. The police lost the jacket.
Suspicious.
Okay? She runs. The police say, in writing to me, in a 2-page letter, completely bizarre, that they write to me, who am I? John Ray the Maverick? Why would you write to him? Because I held a press conference and I said that the commissioner this was a Pink Panther investigation and he was Inspector Clouseau. And you can tell it didn't go over too well with him. So I get this letter in which, during an open active investigation, the Suffolk County homicide detective, who was also the treasurer or the vice president of the detectives union, writes to me on police union stationery, goes outside of the system and says what he heard on the 911 tapes. And what did he say he heard? He said he heard that at all times everybody was calm. You could read the letter. The Suffolk County Police took that letter and several days later they published it in Newsday, not me. So you could read it. Everybody was calm at all times. Shannon, there was no screaming. Shannon never was threatened and never felt any danger. And they claim that's what's on the tape in order to argue that she was nuts that night and that she ran because she was Bax, to put it bluntly. Okay? And in fact, those statements in that letter that became the official position of the Suffolk County Police when it was published in Newsday remained as their narrative right up until May 13th of last year. And you know, because you've heard the tapes, that I fought for years to get and forced them out of the police department. You know that those were lies. They weren't mistakes, errors, misjudgments, opinions about which reasonable people can differ. They were lies. And you have to next ask the question, why were they lying all these years? I don't have an answer for you. I don't have an answer for you. But that's what happened. Sir, you're the, I think I, go ahead.
The man that had the aquarium where they had, he also owned the.
Bissett.
They kind of cleared, first cleared him. But supposedly it was found there was telephone number on his calls. And also, the man committed suicide right after that when he had the world going on.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, he's all the way in the back, and your question was a little long, so it's hard for me to repeat it. But I guess, sir, your question, your point is that Jimmy Bissett, who was a landscaping wholesaler, is somehow involved in this case. He ran the Suffolk County Aquarium, and he committed suicide.
Burke cleared him.
And the gentleman says that Burke cleared him. I don't know if Burke cleared him, I'll take your word, but I don't know that for a fact. What I do know is that Jimmy Bissett had a very unusual involvement in Oak Beach that I personally discovered. And it was this. If you're a wholesaler in any business, any of you people in here work for wholesalers or are wholesalers, you'll agree, know that wholesalers don't compete with their own clients who are the retailers. It's one thing, it's a mortal sin to do, right? Jimmy Bissett had two, his family had two wholesalers, one in, I think, Deer Park, and the official landscaper for Oak Beach was a man named Thomas Canning, who was involved in this case. Canning testified, and I asked questions, but he blurted out to me that he was upset as the official landscaper because he purchased all of his landscaping goods from Bissett Nursery. And he had a personal relationship with Bissett, who interviewed him personally to get 30-day credit when he buys his goods. And he was so angry he stopped working with Bissett because Bissett went into Oak Beach himself and did the landscaping retail on Sal Aversano's house, which was right next door to Barbara Brennan's house. That's the house that Shannon knocked on. The door right across the street from Canning's house and right around the corner from Peter Hackett's house. And Bissett went into that community and personally serviced Aversano's house. Aversano's son, Canning's son, and Hackett's son were all three best friends. Aversano died of an overdose of heroin. Aversano's property was serviced by Bissett personally. Does that make any sense? Of all the places in the world that Bissett would compete against himself, he manages to find Aversano in Oak Beach? Strikingly strange. More than that, I say stick to the evidence. But that evidence exists. Sir, you have it.
There was, I think you might know what I'm talking about. There was a suicide of some other guy after the FBI got involved in the investigation.
Yeah, it was Bissett's assistant.
Yeah. But wasn't there another guy who committed suicide?
I don't know. The ones I remember are Bissett, and then Bissett's assistant became the head of the aquarium, and then he committed suicide.
Wasn't there? I just don't want to say the name of the profession, but it was supposedly there was I hate to say it, a detective or something who killed himself after the FBI got involved.
I don't know of it. I'm sorry. I can't help you with that. Forgive me. Sir? And then I have to come over here because some of the ladies are getting annoyed at me.
First, I want to your assessment on James Burke. Second, when he was rising through the ranks, were there any character issues with him? You know, we saw what resulted in Jim Envy. When he was, because apparently he was holding higher guard when he was coming through the ranks. Were there any character concerns or issues with him? And what is your assessment of it?
Well, just let me take off my jacket if you mind.
Let me hold it.
Can you hold that, thanks.
Your assistant.
You're hired. On the issue of Berkey, he's become more interesting again. You can be sure that when I investigated this case on the Gilbert side, before I got involved with some of the other victims, that I looked at the Burke situation, and I always operated, and I pretty much still do, on the assumption, the presumption, that the police department is acting in good faith. I always take that because, maybe because of the way I grew up, but to me, cops are mostly heroes. Cops are decent, not only decent people, but they're courageous. I've cross-examined detectives in homicide cases who were incredibly courageous. I couldn't believe some of the things they did, and I was their legal enemy. So I say that, knowing that I went into these investigations with that attitude, I kept that attitude always, at all times, that the police know more than I do. You know, I'm the amateur, they're the pros, and I defer to their thinking. And so I did. And so when people would say what I thought I heard some of you say, yeah, it's Burke, he's the bad guy, he's the killer, or we've heard that, he's the killer, or he's involved in the killings, and so on. I always took a step back and said, where's your evidence? Because I know he's a sleaze, and I know what he did. We all know what he did, all right? But I never would use that to jump to that conclusion that he was something worse without evidence. That changes somewhat, maybe not completely, but it changes that attitude that I had. Because Burke himself emerges through the voices of others who are involved. For example, who's the woman that was the commissioner? Geraldine Hart. Thanks, my old age, names, you know how they go. Right. Geraldine Hart, who said that, Burke had suppressed the investigation. When I heard that from the commissioner, that's something, right? And that matched the evidence that we had. People said, well, wait a minute, the cadaver dogs were called off in 2011, the early parts of 2011, because Burke wasn't then in charge, so, that wasn't suppression by Burke, that was by somebody else. Technically may be true, but in fact, at that time, Burke was already the chief of detectives of the district attorney's office, his little Praetorian guard of detectives that he had, who all came from the Suffolk County Police Department, and were in more or less kind of a friendly and sometimes very unfriendly competition with the police. Burke was in charge of the detectives, and he was the power in the Detectives Association, the same stationery that came to me from Detective Stephan in that letter. That letter published only days before Burke became the chief of police in Suffolk County. So Burke was a de facto, extremely important figure, perhaps the man who called the shots when that dog was called off. And when you see pictures of all the famous pictures of all the dogs and the cops walking with the dogs, right, into the marsh, you go, oh, that's pretty impressive, right? If you don't think that there's some public relations going on in these big little politics, you might call it, there was only one cadaver dog. That's the dog that sniffed out the bodies. The others were all for show. They were not cadaver dogs. And when the investigation was called off in the wintertime in 2011, it was because, as the police commissioner Dormer said, the same commissioner that said that Shannon's jeans came off because she ran through the sticker bushes. Commissioner Dormer said that the reason they called off the dogs was because the cadaver dogs didn't work well in the wintertime. So what he did is he effectively said that the dogs were lifeguards. They only work in the summer. And we all know that's absurd. So why was that called off? It was called off for the same reason it was suppressed later on. And it shouldn't have been. And evidence disappears, witnesses go away during that time. So there is a strong amount of evidence that Chief Burke deliberately suppressed the investigation by telling the FBI to get out. And remember, the FBI only played a kind of a toxicological role. They had sent the helicopter over the marsh and didn't see Shannon, by the way, when they had the infrared lights and so on. Didn't pick her up. They said they were playing a relatively passive role, but they were pushed out completely. New York State Police Department, skedaddled. They were out. The Jersey City Missing Persons Bureau was doing a fabulous job through Detective Cesar Camacho on investigating Shannon's disappearance because she lived in Jersey City. So he was called in right away, and Peter Hackett called him and told him that Peter Hackett ran a home for wayward girls. And right away, Camacho said he's a chief suspect. And they took him off the case. He was pushed out. Okay? And the Nassau County Police Department, 2 of those bodies are found on the Nassau County side. Why didn't Nassau County play an active role? They were shut down. The detective sergeant in charge of homicide, not then, but right before then, was a Detective Severin. You can always look him up. You'll see his name all the time in the newspapers. Danny Severin, also known as Devil, that was his nickname. Devil played semi-pro football with me. He was one of my defensive backs for the Long Island Giants. So he's my friend all my life, and I meet with him, have dinner with him, and Danny tells me that they were pushed out. So in every situation, the police were told to get out. And Burke was in charge throughout that whole time. And you say, so why would Burke do that? And there's a lot of good reasons to believe and suspect, nothing that nails it down, but there's no question that he gets busted in rank twice because of his predilection for sex workers. His first sex worker that we know about that he got in trouble with was Loretta Rickenbacker, an African-American girl who was very pretty in her time, and he meets her on Albany Avenue, and if any of you say you go to Albany Avenue, then I know you're a drug dealer. But that's infamous place, and he meets her there when he's working that area, and he has sex with her in the police car, and then later on gives his car to her with his gun in it, and that's how he gets busted in rank, and that happens twice. The second time is a similar situation. His lawyer, his defense lawyer, interesting little fact, in the years when the busts took place, was Thomas Spoda. And it was Spoda who put him into the police in the first place when Burke was only 14. And Burke was never a good guy, that just went bad because he had sexual problems. Burke was never a good guy. When those kids murdered that little Johnny Pius by shoving rocks down his throat, Burke was part of that group. We don't know whether he was actually present when it happened or not. Nobody knows. But it was Burke who testified against his friends that caused the friends to get arrested and go to jail. Testified in the grand jury. He was the key to the bust. And that's why Spoda favored him. And that meant that he hung around with those kids. Those kids were they were burglarizing homes in Smithtown. And so the story goes that they were supposedly scared that Pius knew about the burglaries and was going to turn them in over a stolen bicycle. And I never believed that well. I couldn't find, it didn't sit well in my world, in my thinking, that could have been the real cause. But now, the thought of it, it sort of seeps in. This guy Burke, after he comes out of jail, this risk taker, right, this pervert, he's up in Bald Hill and Farming Hill, where he solicits a man to give the man oral sex and gets busted just recently. You might say, okay, that's crazy. That's, you know, another Suffolk County crazy story. You know, my goodness gracious. But maybe it means more than that, than what you just heard. In itself, it's not necessarily standing alone. When I was doing my work, I get a call from somebody that tells me that a former sex worker out from Oregon, I think it was, she calls me and she says, you know, I had sex with him in the Wading River Motel, and you know, he dressed up as a girl. And I figured, okay, you know, all right, you know, this is oral evidence. How reliable is it? You know, you got to check it out. Then I get another call from somebody else who says, yeah, he dressed up as a girl. And then I end up meeting Loretta, and I became her lawyer. And a lot of the people that you're hearing about that, you know, that I've come forward with witnesses and evidence, they're not only willing to give me evidence, but I help them out in exchange. When they give me real evidence, they're not lying, they're telling me, I help them out. So that girl Nikki that met Hurman up in Port Jefferson, I took her divorce on, I helped her out with a family court case, and I do it all pro bono because I'm doing it for the cause and getting it done. So I did it for Loretta as well. And Loretta tells me, oh yeah, he used to dress in silk girls' underwear, and he liked to he played the female passive role. Then to really put the cap on it, Burke was living with a woman who ran a sex ring out of her beeper. You know, in those days we had beepers, remember that? All right, so you call into the beeper and you get the hookup in a house in Ronkonkoma. Isn't that around here? Yeah, so I don't know. You might know the house, I wouldn't say where it is. But it was a house in Ronkonkoma, and this woman was out of Burke's house. She lived with Burke for 11 years, or 10 or 11, and the hookup, the trysts, male sex workers as well as female sex workers would take place in this house. Same town, by the way, that Loretta would have the hookup. She said, we'd hook up in a house in Ronkonkoma where she would smoke crack with Burke. Remember now, this is a guy who's on his way up to become the chief of police, and he's smoking crack. Okay? And this woman who she ends up, she worked in a hair salon or something, she ends up getting divorced because her husband finds out that she's shacking up with Burke. So he hires a private investigator to follow her. Because he was kind of a very nice guy, by the way. I met him, talked to him at length, and read all his evidence, and he had it right. And he's really still upset to this day about what his wife did to him, you know, by doing this. He didn't know she was doing all of this. He's one of those kind of guys, he just didn't know. And so when he finds out, he's appalled. And he takes Burke's testimony as part of the divorce action. And the private investigator he hires follows Burke around. But it's just another one of the many weird coincidences. You love these coincidences, don't you? I know, I see it. My investigator, back in those days, was the same lady. And so I call Phyllis, and I say, hey, Phyllis, this guy just tells me this story about Burke. She says, oh yeah. She says, I chased him in a car, and he was dressed as a woman. And I chased him. So that's pretty good evidence, I thought, you know. So when you put all that together, while it's amusing, and it is, it's also possibly very macabre and very dark, because now we know that Burke had dual tastes, and that he had those tastes in a very perverse way. Cast your mind back to John, the little boy that gets the rocks, okay, pious. Was the motive burglaries or something deeper? I think that needs to be looked at, given what Burke has done now. He's exposed himself to this by getting busted like that. It's a question that I have. And this is a guy who is you know, you can tell he's a psychopath. Because he knows going up on that hill, he had took a real chance he would get arrested. How did he know that? I have clients over the years who were up on Bald Hill who got busted for exactly the same thing because it was notorious a place to do pickups. Just like the exit 52 or the Long Island Expressway was for years, right? So it was real. He knew that. I read his disciplinary record when he got busted. I read both of them. And in that record, the cops are commenting on what an amazing street smartness Burke had. Preternatural smartness on the street. So a guy like that knows very well where the places are that you're taking a high risk. And he purposely went there and took a high risk. And if you don't think that he's sick in a moral way, think about this as well. When he gets busted, he doesn't say to them, you know, my name is Charlie, you know, Russell or something like that. He says, do you know who I am? He wants them to know. He's more than a jackass. There's something more going on. All right? Ma'am.
I have a question, and it goes back to the burlap, because we need to know about this. When Rick Harriman, got arrested, and the district attorney had that big news conference, and I thought it was really showy. He had a bunch of relatives of some of the women and everything like that. And so he's going on and everything, and I watched the whole thing. And at one point, it just seemed out of the blue, he stopped and he said, oh, I want to clear up a rumor, and it's about the burlap. He said, I don't know where it got started from, but it's not like burlap, like landscape burlap. It's like duck-lined burlap.
Right.
Like camouflage or
Right.
something. And I just thought that was strange that he had to take that time to make this point. And I want to know, what kind of burlap is it that the poor women were around?
According to what we've learned from I went to the arraignment and I heard the reading of the indictments and the details. The burlap was sort of like camouflage, army camouflage. It looked like that, which is used in duck hunting apparently. And it's wrapped around boats as well. It was that kind. So I guess the inference might be that it wasn't Bissett made burlap.
I didn't know. Right.
You know, the landscaping type of burlap. It wasn't that. That's probably true. But what's interesting is that there's a little girl who rides her bicycle at the Massapequa Park Preserve, which is I think called Takapusha Reserve, and there's paths in there, and you ride on the paths. And Hoyman chased her, popped up out of the woods in camouflage, dressed in camouflage, and chased her, and then popped up again. And he didn't do anything to her, but he talked to her, and she got freaked by it. And he did it several places. He stalked her in camouflage. The witness that came to me that I just put in recently, that you've all heard about now, that I had the big press conference with Commissioner Harrison and I about the witnesses that have come to me, and I got their affidavits. I only took, by the way, the affidavits of those who were very credible, and I spent hours on this. Each witness I put in approximately 9 hours before 3 hours, and then another 3 hours, and then meeting them before I actually took their affidavits to make sure that I thought that what they had to say sounded real. And Rodney Harrison himself met with me, with the woman I'm about to tell you about, in New York. I rented a room in my apartment building, and we met her there, Rodney and I, and we examined her for over an hour and a half as well. And he found her very credible. That woman says that when she pulled up, she's a taxi driver, when she came to Ronkonkoma, but it actually turns out to be Bohemia. It's sort of like a border area. And when she came to the bar that was there, she was supposed to pick up the ride that had been called in. This huge man, it turns out to be Uriman, pops out of the nowhere, and he's wearing a camouflage jacket. Okay. I have another witness who I haven't come forward with yet, disclosed, who says that he it wasn't a burlap, it wasn't a camouflage, but it was a flannel shirt that he was wearing. And why did that all matter? Because it's a manner, a mode of dressing that hunters and people who are stalkers would wear. And there's a consistency in all of that. You know, Hoyerman certainly was a stalker. He certainly went after people. So, and he was a duck hunter, and he was a hunter. And what makes that even more interesting is that in the district attorney's inventory list of items seized from the Hoyerman house, one of the items was survivalist material listed, and Newsday has it several times. Survivalist materials. That's not hunters' materials. That's not duck hunters' materials. That's a specific kind of person. They're also known as preppers. You've seen them on TV. There's even a show about it. They kind of imagine that the world's coming to an end, that the nuclear holocaust is going to come, and they're going to survive. And they're going to do everything, you know, and they become Boy Scouts times 3. They go into the woods, they make huts, you know, they go into the marsh, they go into the forests, just like these girls were found. And if you're a survivalist, you belong to a particular group of people. It's like collecting, say, military miniatures, right? Everybody who does that, go on today on the internet, they're serious collectors, they know each other. They trade. They get to know each other. They form groups, they form organizations. Survivalists do too. And the other person who was involved in survivalism was a man who ran a company called Survivalist Dynamics. That was Dr. Peter Hackett. Okay, and that he testified to, and it's in his diary. So it causes you what? Is there a connection? Maybe another one of the amazing, crazy coincidences in this case, and there's no connection. But maybe there is, and it needs to be looked at. You know, I have great faith, as I said, in the cops and the detectives that are working, but I don't know if they're going to have the ability even to examine all these things. There's so many of these things that I haven't even touched on, half of them, right, that exist in this case that need examination. So I know we're getting to our end, and now you had a question, you had your hand up.
You kind of almost answered it. Do we have any knowledge of Rex hanging out in Oak Beach or even having connections to anybody?
You know, there's the possibility that he was there. I don't have anything more than that. I have the someone who's chasing me issue. I have the survivalist issue. I don't know yet of any other issues. The interesting thing was that Hackett's partner in the business, Hackett testified to, was a fellow who was a graduate of the Merchant Marine Academy and had gone on to become a captain of a cruise liner and lives today in Georgia. And this man was supposedly Hackett's partner by Hackett's testimony. When Hoyerman's secretary goes on vacation, she leaves and she goes in a Caribbean cruise. And when she's going, Hackett says, I can find you anywhere. Hoyerman says, I can find you anywhere. Because he stalks people. He follows them. And he gets, by the way, the evidence I have is that not only does he follow them, but he follows people he's angry at. He stalks them. So not all the girls that he slept with, which are probably in the hundreds of sex workers, were murdered. But perhaps those he didn't like for this reason or that. One we know of that was killed because she rolled him with her boyfriend the day, a few days before. Anyway, back to the main point that I was making, which is that the secretary says, no, you would never find me. I'm going to be out in the middle of the ocean. And he said, don't worry, I can find you. 2 days in to this trip, she gets an envelope onto the door. She opens it up, and it's his handwriting saying, see, I told you so, I can follow you. Okay? Now, is there a connection between that and the potentially Hackett sea captain friend? I don't know. You know, could it be that there just could be another wild coincidence? But it's something that should be looked at. And I'm not the investigator. All these people call me. I'm not out pounding pavement looking for them. They call me and then I do the work that I think I'm duty bound to do. And so I still do it, and as you can tell, I think you can tell, I hope you can tell, and I like you all, you've been a great crowd. I'm not giving up. I don't care what they say, do, I just don't give up, and I'm not going to give up until this case is really solved.
Is
And
there a trial date set for?
no, there's no trial date.
No, not-
No, it'll be a long time.
Can
But-
I ask you one final question?
Well, you asked a lot, so it's unfair, all right? So if you don't mind, because there are other people who want to ask that, but you mind, I'm sorry. Sir, you did you speak yet? Go ahead.
I guess I'm naive, but you spoke about these huge sex operations, these women were obviously part of that. When they disappeared, I guess my impression is these women are of value to me. They're disappearing, I'm losing expensive material. Why didn't these gorillas that you were talking about and the sex operations try and get this harrowing clown, find out who was killing their property, reducing their worth? And I guess now that I've heard about this Burka clown, I can see why he didn't do much, because he probably was getting a kickback from the sex people.
It's a great theory, it's speculation, I don't know. I can't
You
answer
would
it.
think they'd go after this guy. It wouldn't be up
One
to
second.
Suffolk County.
That lady?
I think they're disposable, they're commodities, there's losses in it.
Or they don't want to-
Yeah, their shelf life runs out.
Yeah. Volume.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is. They have no value of their life.
Right.
That's the price of
It's
doing it.
That's the cost of that business. Yeah, what a
a
business.
business, it's a real.
What do you think?
Well, folks, I know all right, one more question. You didn't ask yet, or did you? Go ahead.
Okay, with Burke, if he had these odd trends, how come he got moved up and moved up?
Everybody yells out Spoda, but stop. What's your evidence that Spoda himself moved Burke up? You don't have any. And one reason you don't have any is because Spoda was a defense attorney when he came out of the DA's office. He did not run the police department. He had nothing to do with the police department. Although he would get referrals from the police department and they were closely connected, he didn't move people up the ranks, per se. There's no evidence of that. But what there is a hierarchy of police who wear white shirts and gold bands on their shoulders, and they make the decisions as the person moves up. Nobody's looked at that. And nobody's looked to see what they were doing and who was it that really promoted Burke. You know? And I know when I went to the Spoda trial, I went one day and I talked to a reporter there who had sat through the whole trial. She said, you know, 3 out of the 3 white shirts who testified, who had to testify, they were forced into it, had to admit on the witness stand that they were having adulterous affairs ongoing. And so you say, well, you know, I've heard reporters say to me, so what? You know, and I tell them about the switchies going on, the couples, what do you call it, swapping. They're swapping. And I've had people say to me in the media, so what? That's people's private choices. That's okay. It's all okay. Really? Well, let me ask you something. You're a police and you're having an adulterous affair, and Burke knows about it, okay? And he uses it as a blackmail tool. I don't say he ever did that. I don't know that. But the opportunity is there. Or let's take another one. You're not under blackmail, but you have a commonality with the other guy because you cheat on your family. You know, how loyal are you? You cheat on your family? You know, you like sex in this way? Fine. So Burke shows up with a sex worker on his arm. Everybody knows that's what she is. He would take Lorena. She brought herself all up. He would take it to the police function. You don't think the cops knew what was going on? But they looked the other way and even promoted him because they themselves were involved in the same stuff. So that needs to be investigated. How did Burke get there? That's your question. That's my answer.
How
Now,
what's the street
detectives that complained about him, that were demoted or transferred.
Yeah, he was able to push the people out who complained about it. Exactly the point. So there was a typical bureaucracy, right? Weakness, cowardice. You know, I see no evil, I hear no evil, I speak no evil. You do you want, I'll do what I want.
Now, did
That's
they
what
ever-
happened.
Did they ever get put back in rank, or were they?
No, not really.
They got ruined.
So
Yeah, wrecked.
let's finish it up, okay? I say, listen, we care about these girls because they're still alive, aren't they? Their bodies are gone. But if all you believe that a human being is the body, then why bother? You're all going to die, all of us. But we believe that there's a soul, and it's at the heart of our whole heritage. And those souls are still alive. Those souls need something that they don't have. And I know what you're thinking. You're going to use the word justice. I disagree. They don't need justice, but they need something desperately. Justice, I've said it before, I've met justice in my career again and again. You never want to meet justice. Not one of you better ever ask for justice, because you'll get it. And justice is a terrible thing. It's a terrible sword. It's a terrible person, metaphorical person, who's cold and granite-like and maybe even cruel. True justice. It's not justice that we all want. If you think about your own sins, it's mercy. You want mercy. That's how I see it. They need mercy. They don't get mercy until truth comes out. Truth will bring them mercy, the mercy of God. And He is in charge of the truth. And they are still His creatures. And they need that mercy, the mercy of the truth. And so I stay in this and I fight to the end. And that's my real reason